Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending when you're listening to this, and welcome to the second episode of Tax in the Spotlight, which is the Safri Sports and Entertainment podcast. I'm Pete Hackleton, partner and head of the sports and entertainment team at Safri, and today I'm joined by James Taylor, one of our directors, who looks after many of our motorsport clients. As you can probably guess, in this episode, we're going to explore the world of motorsport and the various tax considerations and wider areas those involved in the industry need to be aware of. James, hello.
Hi, Pete. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. And you?
Yeah, I'm very good. Very good.
Good. Well, thanks for joining me today, and let's get straight onto it. Maybe it'd be good for the listeners if we can just start off by talking about how we work with our motorsport clients. What do Safri do?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, thank you for this, inviting me along, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. So Safri have worked in the motorsport sector for several decades now, going back to the kind of the 80s when a lot of law changes happened in the UK. We're currently working with drivers across all levels of sport, from go-karting through to F1 and world endurance racing, as well as working with agents, teams, team staff and sponsors. At its very simplest level, we can help clients with their accounts, tax filings and other corporate filings as are necessary. Through our outsourcing team, we help drivers and businesses manage their day-to-day bookkeeping and general business function, such as being able to invoice their customers, make payments to their suppliers, managing bank accounts and paying staff, all on the client's behalf. Thanks to the long-standing involvement in the sector, we are able to offer a lot of advisory services as well. So we're regularly asked to review endorsement contracts alongside the legal team. We advise the best business structures for clients to use, as well as helping with other more simple things like just the acquisition of assets such as cars and property. Just earlier today, I was chatting to a client about buying a very, very luxury, expensive sports car, which is not uncommon in this industry. And yeah, that's all just to make sure that the clients are doing everything as tax efficiently and as compliant as possible. Where our expertise are particularly valuable, although I find, is on the international side. We've got an in-depth knowledge of worldwide taxes and all of the accounting requirements that drivers may face along the way throughout the world. And we work alongside a brilliant network of specialist advisors around the world to help support that and deal with the local filings as are necessary. As we know, the higher levels of the sport, it is truly global. And not many people will realize this or appreciate this, but F1 drivers, for instance, will actually be paying tax in over 10 different countries every year, thanks to the fact that Grand Prix are competed in so many different locations around the world. And those obligations that they have in each of those territories are often very different. And so it needs someone to have an understanding, or a network of people to have an understanding of how to help those clients deal with that, as I say, to make sure they remain compliant and ahead of the curve.
Excellent. And thank you for that, James. What, in advising these clients, what are the key areas to watch out for?
So, I mean, one thing to mention, especially looking at F1, which I'll touch on quite a bit in this, is the fact that the average age of professional drivers these days has come down quite considerably over the last few decades. And so, I mean, looking at the likes of Kimi Antonelli, who's breaking records as the youngest driver in history to lead an F1, only shortly after his 18th birthday, when he was able to first take his driving test in Italy legally. They're very mature for their age, but they're still young and need a lot of guidance, especially because they're just going to be so heavily scrutinized for any wrongdoing because they're so in the spotlight here. So from our side as accountants and tax advisors, I would say the key area to consider will be structuring the business throughout the career, whatever stage they're at. Structuring the career primarily in terms of the upfront capital that might be needed to fund that career, because it's often quite a large amount, but also where to base that structure. It might be that an individual wants to move or a company wants to move, and having the right geographical location for that structure can be crucial as well. As I mentioned, motorsport is notoriously expensive, and so it does require a lot of upfront capital usually. Seats in F3 and F2, the junior categories leading up to F1, will often cost upwards of £2 million a year, just for the opportunity to race with one of these teams in that series to then hopefully make the step up into F1 in the future. So whether that funding is coming from parents, sponsors, or as part of a racing team's junior program, making sure they understand how that funding is treated and how to structure it in the best way to make the most tax efficient outcome in the end is going to be key for them. And understanding that from as early as possible is going to be key. A couple of examples here might be if parents are making a loan to a child or a gift to a child to make sure that they can get through those early years. Racing, even karting, is very expensive. Structuring that in a way that it might be possible to repay that loan later on tax-free once hopefully the child makes a successful career out of it and is earning some decent profits. Or potentially family companies or third-party companies sponsoring a career and making sure that they can get the tax deduction for that sponsorship if necessary. Only a couple of examples there. It is very complex and each case needs to be considered individually, but it's something we can help with.
Yeah, thank you for that, James. That's interesting. So you talked about structuring their affairs and some of the issues that we need to consider when we're looking at these elite drivers. How do you decide whether the drivers should trade through a company or trade individually? And how do you decide in which country you might set up those kind of structures?
Yeah, exactly. As I say, that's crucial. So, I mean, to start with, it's worth noting that professional racing drivers have always been considered independent contractors. So unlike footballers, as we discussed in the first episode of the podcast, those people are employees. They're employed by a club that they play for, whereas drivers can move around. They're independent, so they provide their services to a team at any one time. And as an independent contractor, they can choose to provide their services as an individual, which might be considered a sole trade, or through a corporate entity that they might incorporate. And often that might be beneficial. Setting up the company and running through that does add a level of complexity, but it also comes with a whole host of benefits. So a corporate would provide the driver with kind of limited legal liability in the event of a lawsuit. It might often provide tax advantages, depending on the jurisdiction it's set up in. And also you can bring on directors to help run that company and take some of the burden away from the driver, which is something they quite often don't want to have to deal with day to day when they're racing and focusing on that part of their career. So a driver who trades as a sole trader will almost always be subject to tax in the country that they live and where they base themselves. And a company, it might be slightly different. They usually pay tax in the country where they are resident, which is usually where they're managed and controlled, not necessarily where they're set up. Some people look at that and think kind of all great ideas, I'll just set up a company offshore and not pay any tax. There are quite a lot of worldwide anti-avoidance tax laws that prevent that. And so you couldn't have a driver who lives in the UK, races in the UK, just pick a country overseas that doesn't have any tax and trade through that. There would be plenty of laws to prevent that. But it's still something that we can consider because offshore companies, even though they might not have a tax benefit, might have other benefits. It doesn't always have to be that the company has to be based in the same country that you live. But again, it is complex, and so it just needs to be considered carefully. But as a global sport, professional drivers often do have quite a bit of flexibility as to where they live and where they base themselves. They're often on the road a lot, and so having a fixed family home in a place that they want to live is not always as important as them as, say, a footballer who might want to be based in the same country all the time. So often they will have the flexibility to set themselves up in a jurisdiction that, for instance, might have tax benefits, if it's also a convenient place to live and travel from, usually as well. As I mentioned earlier, different countries all have different taxes. So, for instance, remaining in the UK, as I'm sure a lot of people will know, we have income tax rates up to 45%, not including the kind of social security that we add on top of that as well. Whereas some countries around the world, as people are aware of, places like Dubai and Monaco, might have a zero rate of tax or no tax. So it might be quite attractive to simply move overseas and base themselves there. It's the same with companies. A UK company, if it's paying taxes here, will usually pay tax on its profits of 25%, whereas some countries around the world will have a 0% tax for its corporates. And so again, that can be attractive depending on the situation.
I mean, you and I, James, have looked at clients before, particularly in the F1 sector where, we've looked at the UK as a good place to base yourself under the res non-dom rules. Perhaps their income comes from outside of the UK. They wouldn't need to bring much in. Obviously, the UK tax rules have changed, concept of domicile going away. Many other countries have, as you just mentioned, complex tax legislation, which makes it difficult. So I guess the obvious question from my side is, like some drivers, why haven't they just all moved to Monaco?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Monaco, I think over half of the F1 grid now live in Monaco. And so obviously there are very good reasons for that. Obviously, geographically, a lot of races are in the F1 calendar are in Europe. And so centrally placed for that, it is quite close to Nice Airport, which is very handy to get around, especially if you've got a helicopter that can nip you over to the airport quite quickly, which is always lovely. But also the tax position. Yeah, look, on paper, there's zero tax in Monaco. So why not just move there? Easier said than done. Obviously, for an F1 driver, this isn't usually a problem, but the cost of living is clearly very high, as is the case for most tax havens. The rental market out there is really the only affordable way to move in for most people. Buying a property over there is incredibly expensive, especially for a sports person who doesn't know how long they're going to be there. They would usually consider renting. A one-bed apartment in Monaco might be as much as €10,000 a month. And they're not that luxurious in most cases. And so it is a large amount to pay for a very short period of time spending in that property. But also the local amenities, a lot of stuff around Monaco is very expensive. Again, there's a certain level of lifestyle that people like to live. And so it can be very expensive to base themselves there, which, again, not massively problematic for an F1 driver, but for more junior people in the sport might not be able to jump into it quite so soon. Also, in order to obtain the residence permit in Monaco, well, usually you would have to have at least €500,000 in a local bank to be able to obtain what's known as a bank attestation, in terms of getting the bank to approve you as being able to afford to live there, so that the local authorities could give you that visa residence permit to actually live there and spend time there, which you would in most cases need to be able to spend enough time there to live there and class yourself as a resident. So yeah, I mean, it's expensive to live there, but there are other countries around the world that offer a similar situation for lower cost of living, and we see a lot more of these kind of non-traditional tax havens offering tax incentives to live there. Places like Portugal and Italy in the past have offered people tax incentives to move into those countries that might be a bit more affordable for someone to move into. But typically, motor racing drivers, they do tend to lean towards Monaco. Again, they've got a good network there. A lot of their colleagues, as you may call it, and friends will live around there. But it's not always just a zero tax policy either. I mean, Monaco is part of France for VAT purposes. So there are some taxes there. There are estate taxes, which is the equivalent of our inheritance tax in the UK. And also, it's worth considering, as I've kind of briefly mentioned, that you don't just pay tax as a Formula One driver or a motorsport professional driver in the country that you live. You will often pay tax in the country where you perform as well. So living in Monaco doesn't completely scrap the tax altogether. Drivers will often pay taxes in places like the UK, the US, France, and more countries are coming on board with that now. And so usually there is still a tax payable on a worldwide basis for these individuals, and whether they trade as an individual or a company. And given that there's no tax in Monaco, there's no tax to offset that against. There's a great network of tax treaties around the world that mean if you pay tax in one country, you tend to not pay tax in another to prevent double taxation. And usually that's dealt with by means of being able to deduct one tax from another. With no tax in Monaco, if you pay tax in another country, like I say, the US or UK, there's nothing to offset that against. So that is a direct cost. So there's still taxes to consider even if you move to Monaco. And so it has to be worth it to pay all that extra cost in rent and parking your car and everything else that comes with living in Monaco that's so expensive. But also, as I mentioned, there are some taxes. There is a business profits tax in Monaco. It's, again, not something that a lot of people are aware of. It follows a rate of tax set by the French government, and it's a tax on trade, essentially, on trading income earned by people living in Monaco. It doesn't usually affect athletes, I'll admit, but it's something that, as tax around the world is becoming more transparent and more political, it's something that is being looked at in a bit more detail, and we do have to be careful of it. Essentially, the tax authorities in Monaco will deem personally earned income in a non-commercial sense to be tax-free, but if it's commercial income, of which the definition I won't go into now, it can be subject to these business profits taxes of up to 25%. And so it's something that we do have to consider. And if people are earning income, sometimes in the case of royalties and other type of commercial income, they may be subject to tax in Monaco on that income. So again, it's not a free tax on everything in all cases. It does need to be looked at quite carefully.
Thank you for that. Interested to hear your thoughts on the future, I guess. I mean, I obviously do a lot of football work now, but in the past, when I used to do more on the individual side, I remember doing presentations where we used to say, the UK and the US are the two main territories where you have to file returns and pay tax. And clearly, as you said, France now levy tax. I'm sure there are a lot more countries now that require drivers to file tax returns and pay taxes locally. What does the future tax landscape look like in motorsport?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you say, more and more countries are coming on board, and we I think it was 2021 was one of the more recent cases where the Spanish tax authorities, who had traditionally always had deep down in their legislation the power to tax foreign sports people coming into the country on a portion of their income, had never taxed professional drivers in the country. And that suddenly came about, that they approached F1 and said, look, we want this tax now. We want a slice of this, and we want to tax the drivers, and ask them all to file tax returns there, which they're now all doing. And the most recent case, which has been keeping us very busy over the last few months, has been Australia. The Australian F1 race in Melbourne earlier this year, just last month, was the first time that the Australian tax authorities had asked the F1 drivers to pay tax in that country. And in that case, it was a matter that the teams had to withhold tax on the drivers. And so we've been working with the Australian Tax Office, Australian tax specialists that we work with in Melbourne, drivers, teams, representatives, to make sure that that was all organised as efficiently as possible, because there was no set standard of how it should run. And so making sure that the Australian tax authorities were pleased with what they were able to achieve, while also making sure that it was a fair tax take from the drivers, was crucial. And so we had to get on top of that very quickly with very little notice to make sure that all of the drivers that we work with were filing in the most tax efficient way possible, which I like to think we did achieve. And yeah, it was last minute, but we got to a great result, and a lot of our clients are very happy with that. But more and more countries can come on board like that, and it can happen last minute. We're consistently talking to professionals around the world to make sure that we're up to speed with the local tax laws. And it wouldn't surprise me if maybe a few more tax territories come on board and want to tax drivers in the future. Also, new races in F1 and other sports might start to pop up in countries that they've not raced in before. Years ago, there was a race in India that caused a nightmare of a headache in terms of the tax consequences, and all of the teams spent years dealing with that. Most of whom in hindsight said they would have never gone to India had they have known the tax implications in the first place. But it's highly political. It always will be, always has been, and it's getting more and more so. And so the drivers have to be very careful about the way they operate. The teams are even more careful about the way they operate, but doing the best they can to maximize their net earnings in the short career that they may have is crucial at the end of the day.
Thank you for that. Just in case anybody thinks that our conversations are totally scripted, I just thought I'd throw in one extra question for you. So, James, who, in your opinion, is going to win the F1 Championship in 2025?
Well, I like to consider myself a complete neutral, because we do work with a number of different drivers, which is amazing. But I love the cool-headed nature of Oscar Piastri at the moment. I think he looks like a real title winner. He's obviously won 2 races very recently, so he's at top of the championship at the moment. So it's a kind of easy answer for me. But I think long-term, I think he could go very far as well.
Excellent. Well, we'll hold you to that come the end of the season. Thank you for that, James. And thank you for providing such a comprehensive overview of the motorsport world. As ever, we should note that this is a very complex area, and so you should always take professional advice, and ideally from Safri. That's all for this episode of Tax in the Spotlight. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our show. If you have any questions on today's topic or to find out more about us, please head to www.safri.com and drop us a line. Thank you very much for listening.